Tensions are high in Glasgow as the parties argue over the small print of the climate agreement until well into the night. So I'm starting today's update by listening to those living on the front line of climate change. Meet Carson and Victor, co-chairs of the United Nations Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Actually, I'm going to let them do the introductions.
Liosumchani avu, haisoamper Victor Teak, Haumatakiapi. My name is Victor. My name in Dakota is Walkiamani, and my Yaqui name is Mitchell. I'm here at COP representing the International Indian Treaty Council and the United Nations Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, supported by IFAD.
Kiburo, Carson. My name is Carson Kiburo, and Endora is from Kenya. And I'm here with the International Indian Treaty Council, as well as IFAD, that is International Fund for Agricultural Development. Climate issue is very personal to me. I got conscious about it over the last 2 decades when I used to see the seasons changing a lot, and our rivers drying, our wetlands changing or disappearing completely, and the rain patterns, and also losing a lot of pasture lands and grazing fields. Well, I come from pastoralist community, almost changing into agro-pastoralism, so we see the effects every day in, day out. And so I endeavor to advocate for the adaptation and resilience measures and try to educate my community on how we can stay afloat during these most challenging and defining moment of our time.
I'm from 2 tribes, the Yaqui and the Dakota, Crow Creek Sioux. The Yaqui are in Arizona and northern Mexico, and we live in one of the most driest places on the planet, the Sonoran Desert, which is getting drier and drier every year now. We're seeing less and less rain as each and every year goes by. Our rivers are drying up. The fish that were usually endemic to our area are no longer coming. Our traditional food sources are being harmed because of lack of access to fresh water. We are growing people, and we are unable to plant our traditional foods in the way that we used to support our communities. And in addition to that, the animals that we usually live off of and that we do traditional hunting of aren't coming into the area as much anymore without access to water as well. And then there's the forest fires that are affecting my community in South Dakota. Even though we live so far apart, to be able to advocate on the same issues that we share as Indigenous youth, it feels very powerful.
We're trying to get parties to even get a little bit of some text on human rights in Article 6. That would make sure that Indigenous communities and other vulnerable communities who are facing the brunt of the climate change will be able to access climate funds.
I just want to say one more thing, that just off of what Carson was talking about in terms of how important it is for Indigenous communities to have climate adaptation funds. Right now, as the climate is changing very quickly, Indigenous communities are adapting to the changing climate. We've always been adaptable people, but it's changing a lot quicker now. So in many cases, we need support in order to implement those measures as Indigenous communities who've been marginalized.
Climate finances and adaptation are at the heart of the climate talks. Today's theme was Cities and Built Environment. Lauren Sorkin, director of the Resilient Cities Network, explains how cities can cope, although you might not like Singapore's new water.
Cities are responsible for 2/3 of the emissions. They also concentrate risk, and most vulnerable communities are in cities. It's nations who commit, but it's cities who actually deliver results, right? When something happens, a flood or a heat wave, you don't call your national government, right? You call your mayor or your city representative or council member, right? And you seek their help in changing the city in ways that will better be able to serve you. So cities are really in that front line in terms of delivery of the kinds of projects that will protect citizens and also that are going to transform the systems like transport, waste, and energy. So in some ways, resilience for Singapore is part of the DNA. Singapore is very water poor, but over time has developed innovative technologies in order to be able to produce its own water. In fact, we all in Singapore pretty much drink our own wastewater. It's called new water, but it tastes just fine. It works just fine. We've all really personally experienced climate impacts now, and I think that's another thing that makes this COP different than others. Even if you just look at the last 6 months, the heat waves that we've experienced, the floods across Europe, across Asia, and the wildfires that have been raging this year. Climate change is now incredibly personal.
I headed to the Science Pavilion to find out more about heat, health and cities from Dann Mitchell, Professor at Bristol University.
One of the problems with global warming is that it doesn't warm uniformly across the globe. It heats more over land than the oceans, and of course we live on land. And actually within the cities themselves it heats even more, so it's this urban heat island effect that traps the heat. UK cities are very old, they're not very efficient cities at all. You know, our cities have evolved around rivers or around battling the French. We didn't have flow of air in mind, we didn't have green spaces in mind. And that's a real problem, especially because a lot of our buildings can't be moved or can't even be touched. Our grade 2 listed buildings, for instance, can't be modified at all. So we can't create those green spaces in the cities, which we know are a really good way to cool down the city. There are other techniques. We could talk about green roofing. So that's where you sort of plant or have a garden on the roof. Or we can talk about different coloured roofs, so like white or very light reflective colours, and essentially reflect that heat away from the city.
When it comes to reaching net zero, will it be cities or companies that lead the way? Ajay Gambhir from the Imperial College London Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment shared his views.
I think cities are incredibly powerful because they represent a large proportion of the world's population. There's going to be a huge amount of urbanisation and the growth of cities and towns in the coming years, and they are potentially a sort of more flexible and faster moving unit than a whole country. But having said that, it's very difficult to say that cities will be more important or at the forefront of the transition over and above companies. I think companies are often consumer brands and they're things that people recognise, and they have a really big role. I think at this stage there is a lot of greenwashing. I think that's inevitable. If you look around Glasgow, you'll see every company claiming to be planning for or contributing to a net zero economy, and I think it's impossible for companies to have really thought about all that entails.
Over the past 2 weeks, I have been impressed by climate experts and climate activists, perhaps because we're all on the same side after all. From peaceful marches to drumming circles in the middle of George Square, people are desperate to protect our planet. Will the fine details of the Glasgow Climate Agreement reflect this passion? We'll find out tomorrow.